Today, by popular request, we are out here taking a look at the 2016 BMW X1. The X1 is BMW's smallest and least expensive crossover, and it has been completely redesigned for this model year. The last generation X1 had a well-deserved reputation for incredible handling. That was because it was a rear-wheel drive compact crossover in a sea of front-wheel drive compact crossovers. The last generation X1 was actually based off of a BMW 3 Series from the E90 generation. You could actually think of that one as sort of a BMW 3 Series wagon that was lifted up a little bit. The 2016 X1 is completely different because this is now more closely related to the Mini Countryman. That means this is a front-wheel drive based BMW, although in the United States BMW is being very careful and there is no two-wheel drive version of the X1. They're all-wheel drive. As I've come to expect from BMW, the X1 looks very much like the rest of the BMW family. We get this larger kidney grille up front and we get optional LED headlamps. If you opt for the optional M Sport package on your X1, then you do get more body-colored paint on the front. Instead of growing, the X1 has actually shrunk for 2016. This is about 2 inches shorter than the last generation X1 at 174.8 inches long. Part of the reason the X1 has shrunk for 2016 is that the rest of the competition is still a decent amount shorter than this. The Range Rover Evoque, for instance, is 4 inches shorter overall than the 2016 X1. Even though this model has shrunk versus the last generation model, we get more room on the inside because of what's going on right up here. This is now, again, as I said, a front-wheel drive model in certain world markets or front-wheel biased in the United States. Again, all-wheel drive is standard. But that means this hood is actually a little bit shorter than before. So BMW has managed to push the passenger compartment a little bit further forward. They've also made the overall shape of the X1 a little bit more efficient in terms of overall packaging. Most of the luxury car companies out there prefer this one style fits all sizes design language, and as a result, we see a very similar back end to the BMW X5 and X3. Because all models of X1 in the United States use the same engine, we all get twin exhaust tips in the back. Around the world, you will find various engines under the hood of the X1, but in the United States, we just get this 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder engine. This is closely related to the last generation X1's 2-liter turbo, although it is a little bit less powerful in 2016. It produces 228 horsepower and 258 pound-feet of torque. Of course, the biggest difference is that this engine is sitting across the front of the vehicle, not sitting down the vehicle lengthwise like we see in every other BMW. That is, again, because in other world markets, this is sold as a front-wheel drive vehicle. So this does use a front-wheel drive automatic transaxle. That transaxle is an 8-speed ISIN unit that's also seeing duty in certain Volvo and Lexus models. You'll notice, of course, that the front suspension is right back here behind the engine, and that means that this does not have the same kind of weight balance we saw in the previous generation X1. It was nearly 50-50 in that model. This is a little bit closer to 60-40. Fuel economy remains essentially the same as the last generation all-wheel drive 2-liter X1 at 22 miles per gallon city, 32 highway, and 26 combined. I found the front seats to be a little bit less comfortable than we found in the Q3. Our particular model does have the 4-way optional lumbar support that's not standard in the base model of the X1. Neither is leather upholstery. Things start out with Sensatec imitation leather. However, we do have a tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion, and BMW does make their excellent sport seats available in the X1 as well. The biggest thing that I noticed is that the seat bottom cushion is not terribly long. That means without an extending thigh cushion, I found these seats to be a little bit less supportive than the rest of the competition. Also worthy of note is that these are not terribly wide seats. So if you are a larger or wider person, you may find these a little bit less comfortable than the Lincoln MKC or the Audi Q3. When it comes to the rear seats, it is instantly obvious that this X1 is a little bit bigger on the inside than the last generation, because I actually have an extra 1.5 inches of legroom back here. That's also aided by the fact that the front seats are a little bit higher off the ground, giving you a more crossover-like driving position. The previous generation X1 was a little bit more like a tall station wagon. Like the front seats, the seat bottom cushions in the rear are a little bit short for my tastes. Aiding in rear seat comfort, the rear seats also recline, and they have a decent amount of recline motion to them. You can also put them in a very upright position to help square off the cargo area. Sitting in the middle seat, it is obvious that headroom is very generous in the X1, and we're in the model with the panoramic moonroof. I still have about 2 inches of headroom left in the middle. Moving all the way over to the right side of the vehicle, this front seat was adjusted for a 6'5" passenger I had in the front of the car. I still have about 1 inch of legroom left. In addition to the rear seats reclining, this is actually a 40-20-40 folding rear seat back. In addition, each of these 40% outboard sides fold down independently of the center section, so you could have large items on either side of one person probably a very skinny person, strapped right here in the center, but it does make this rear seat an awful lot more practical than some of the options out there in this segment. The rear headrest also folds flat to give you a little bit better view out the back. Now on the downside, the center seat belt does come out of the ceiling, not out of the seat back itself. And that means that if you do plan on putting child seats right here in the middle, they can be skewed a little bit to one side or the other, making it a little bit less comfortable for a person to sit next to that child seat. Even though the X1 has shrunk a little bit for 2016, the cargo area has actually gotten a little bit bigger. This is about 2 cubic feet larger than it was before. As a result, we have a larger and more practical cargo area than we find in the Audi or the Mercedes. BMW really likes run flat tires, and so we do find run flats in our model. However, we do have a large well underneath the load floor because you can get a spare tire optionally in the X1. This storage well is not quite large enough to conceal a 24-inch roller bag, as you can see, but it is very close. Although the cargo area in the X1 is larger than the competition, I'm going to have to deduct 1 point for the lack of the spare tire under here. I really wish that was standard and the run flats were optional rather than the other way around. I also have to add that I personally prefer a roller tonneau cover to these hard covers because they're a little bit more difficult to store when you find yourself needing to carry large cargo home and you haven't left your tonneau cover at home. However, we do have electrically reclining rear seats back here, which is a very practical touch. You can recline them from either the front of the vehicle or from the back. We also have a power port. Everything is finished very nicely back here. And we also have some grocery bag holders, as well as this power tailgate. Let's take a quick spin around the interior. We are in the model with the optional panoramic moonroof. You can see that it extends quite far back in the vehicle, right over those rear seats. Now the driver and the front passenger do not have height adjustable seatbelts like you will find in some of the competition, and we have only two-way adjustable headrests. The front doors are constructed of mainly soft touch plastic, and our model has the optional wood trim. You can see it right there between the cabin ambient lighting. So there is that small strip right above and right below that wood trim. The rest of the door panel is constructed out of soft touch plastic, and we do have a stitched middle section here that matches the seats. You will find hard plastics lower in the door, which is pretty typical in this particular segment, right around this storage bin. The style of the interior is very similar to what we see in other BMW models. We have, again, more optional wood trim right here on the dashboard, and then we have this infotainment display that pops up out of the dashboard. It looks sort of like a tablet computer grafted onto it. The glove compartment is a little bit larger than I had expected. It's also a slot affair, so you can see we can fit large items right there inside. I was able to fit a small tablet computer in there as well. Taking a closer look at the center of the dashboard, we do have the center channel speaker in our model. This is the defogger grate right up here, and then these vents on either side are actually pointed at the driver and the front passenger. They're to give you a little bit more of a diffuse air output than you find with these vents right below the infotainment screen. Speaking again of that infotainment screen, you can see this does pop up out of the dashboard, sort of like a tablet computer grafted onto it, and we are in the X1 with the slightly smaller display. There is a larger wide format display, very similar to what you see in certain BMW 3 Series models as well. Obviously the displays are different sizes, but we get some additional features and functions in that up-level iDrive system as well. We get finger writing recognition, and because the screen is wider, you can actually use two sides of the screen to do two different things. Below that, we find the two large air vents, hazard light button, controls for that audio system. We have forward and backward for our tracks, preset buttons right down here along the bottom, and these can actually be assigned to a wide variety of different functions inside iDrive, not just radio presets. We have our mode, band, and then volume and power knob. We also have a single slot optical displayer in the dashboard. The dual zone climate control should be very familiar to you if you've driven any other BMW models, and this is also where you'll find the buttons for the heated seats. We have two large cup holders. Now they are positioned a little bit low in the dashboard and under this section of the dash. That means that if you do put large takeout drinks here, you can end up bopping them on this portion of the dash trying to remove them. We also have some additional storage right here for keys, that sort of thing, in a small well. Right in front of that, you'll also find a 12-volt power outlet. Instead of a joystick-style shifter like we see in other BMW models, we have a more traditional console shifter with sort of a Cobra head-style shift button right up front. Park is all the way to the front, drive is all the way down, sport mode is one click over to the left. This is also where you engage manual mode by either clicking down for up or up for down. It's a little bit reversed from what we see in other cars out there. To the left of the shifter, we find the traction control off button. We find the drive mode selector, so we can engage either Sport Mode or Eco Pro, or of course the default of Comfort. Behind that, we have Parking Sense Enable Disable and the Hill Descent control button. Depending on which iDrive system you get in your X1, this controller will be a little bit different. If you get the up-level system, you find a larger dial with the finger writing recognition that we see in other up-level BMW models. Even though we are in the low-end system, you can still get navigation in this interface. We have a Nav Direct Access button, telephone, media, radio, menu, back, and option. This of course rotates around sound, toggles side to side, and then clicks down to enter. Between the front seats, we find a softly padded center armrest. It is a ratchet style, so that's the lowest it goes, and then it ratchets up into position. It also opens up to reveal a fairly small storage cubby where you could put a wallet or a smartphone, that sort of thing inside, or you can lift it completely out of the way to reveal another storage bin that doesn't have a real lid to it. So when this is ratcheted up into position, you can still access whatever is in that bin below there, like your smartphone. This is also where you'll find the USB input and the auxiliary input. Now, one thing worth noting is that there is no additional 12-volt power port in here, so you would have to plug something in above the shifter and then plug the USB port or the auxiliary input audio port right there in that console. Over on the driver's side, we have one of BMW's typical 4-needle instrument clusters with the fuel gauge right over here and then a mile per gallon gauge right over here on the right. Tachometer on the right. Between the gauges, we have a small multifunction LCD. The display is mainly controlled via this BC button on the turn signal stalk. Clicking the BC button cycles us through our various inputs like our average fuel economy, distance to empty, and how much fuel we've saved by being in Eco Pro mode. This display will also give you a multimedia readout, so we can actually scroll through things using this scroll wheel on the right side of the steering wheel and then click a particular item to start playing that track. The steering wheel is a 3-spoke design with a very interesting style. You can actually stick your finger right here under this trim section of the steering wheel. This is to sort of mirror what's going on the dashboard with some of the cut-ins and cut-outs. We have larger sport grips up top, but no sport grips on the bottom. On the right side of the steering wheel, we have the controls for the audio system. We have a phone hang-up pickup button, voice command button, volume up, down. This scrolls through the tracks, clicks to enter, and we have a mode button. The left side of the steering wheel is where you'll find the cruise control buttons. Now, our model does not have the optional radar adaptive cruise control system. Over here on the right side of the driver, you can better see that ambient lighting system. So we have that ribbon of orange right there. You can choose between orange and white. And then we have that same sort of thing mirroring right there under that satin metal trim underneath the wood trim itself. It goes all the way back to the back portion of the door right there. In a somewhat unusual twist, you'll also see it right back here on the rear doors. Now, a lot of vehicles, especially in this price segment, skip the ambient lighting in the rear of the cabin. Obviously, the feel of the X1 out on the road has changed versus the 2015 model year because this is a very, very different vehicle. Now again, in the United States, there is no front-wheel drive version of the X1, and you will find front-wheel drive versions of most of the competition. Even so, the previous generation X1 was the only rear-wheel drive entry in this particular segment, and as such, it had a very different position in the lineup. Now, acceleration is actually a little bit better than the last generation X1, even though this engine has lost power, and we ran from 0 to 60 in 6.2 seconds. 6.2 seconds is notably quicker than the Q3, which is quite slow for this particular segment, but it's also a little bit quicker than the Mercedes-Benz GLA, which is very light and has that dual clutch transmission. Now, if fast acceleration is your thing in your compact luxury crossover, look no further than the GLA 45 AMG. The AMG version of that GLA is incredibly, incredibly quick. The GLA 45 isn't necessarily any more refined than the GLA 250, but it is considerably faster. When it comes to braking, the X1 scored fairly well. This is a fairly light crossover. However, the tire size on this particular vehicle is limited to 225 with tires. You will find wider tires on some of the competition, and as a result, the braking distances are just a little bit longer in this. Those narrow tires also affect the handling score, and while the BMW X1 used to be tops in this segment, now the top in this segment is the Audi Q3. The Q3 has some incredibly wide tires and a very, very well sorted suspension. The Q3's grip is absolutely incredible for this segment, and the X1 is definitely a little bit lower. In fact, when it comes to handling, I'm actually going to put this third in this particular segment. I do think that the GLA 250 has a slightly better feel out on the road. When it comes to the ride, I was a little bit concerned initially about the X1 because this is based off of the Mini Countryman. They're closely related. However, BMW didn't just reskin a Countryman, and that is an important distinction. The drivetrain is unique in this particular vehicle, and the suspension is not exactly the same either. As a result, this has a much more sorted feeling than the Mini Countryman. The Countryman has kind of an odd feeling, especially on rough pavement in the corners. It feels more like a traditional Mini. Even out here on this gravel road, the ride is still very polished in the X1. Now, this is a little bit firmer than you'll find in the Lincoln MKC, which is a fairly soft ride for this particular segment. However, the ride is a little bit softer than the last generation X1, which was more of an athletic feel. When it comes to cabin noise, like most entries in this segment, we scored 69.5 decibels, which is a good entry, and it is fairly quiet. BMW has employed a substantial amount of sound deadening in the firewall, so we don't really get a whole lot of engine noise in the cabin. Fuel economy has been excellent this week. We've been averaging 26.5 miles per gallon, which is a little bit better than the EPA says you should get in the X1. That's largely due to this 8-speed automatic transmission and BMW's EcoPro mode, which I have been using for the most part during my commute. EcoPro not only smooths out throttle inputs, but it also shifts this transmission to neutral when coasting whenever the vehicle thinks it's more efficient. This is basically the same system that we see in a wide variety of other BMW models, typically with the ZF 8-speed automatic transmission. When you're comparing fuel economy in this segment, it is important to keep in mind that this is available only as an all-wheel drive vehicle in the United States. So it may appear that this fuel economy is a little bit lower than the competition, but in fact, this is among the best. The last generation X1 wasn't necessarily the most practical entry in the segment. It wasn't necessarily the best priced in the segment. It didn't get the best fuel economy in the segment either, but it was by far the most fun in the segment. And this generation X1 is just a little bit different. This is now one of the better priced options in the segment. It's much more practical than it was before. It's more comfortable than it was before. It's quieter than it was before. It's just not as much fun as it was before. BMW has made the pricing fairly simple for 2016, although you can configure your X1 with just about every option you'd expect out of a modern BMW. Things start at $34,800. If you fully equip your model, you'll end up right around $50,000. This particular model is a mildly equipped model, right in the middle of that range. The Audi Q3 starts at $33,700 and the Mercedes GLA is $32,500 starting. Both of those are the closest direct competitors to the X1. Then we get some of the sideways competitors. We get the Range Rover Evoque, which is right about this size, but is trying to be a more premium entry. It doesn't start until $41,475, so it is significantly more expensive than an X1. Then we get the Lincoln MKC, which is larger than this. It really is more of a Volvo XC60, perhaps a BMW X3 competitor. It's right about the same price, however, at $33,260. A lot of that lower price tag, and the reason that price tag is more similar to this than the BMW X1, is because Lincoln is not quite at the same level as the German luxury brands in terms of overall positioning. I've seen a number of people also compare this to the Volvo XC60. Now that seems like a valid comparison because they're both starting out as front-wheel drive vehicles, but the XC60 is also more expensive than this at $36,600. It's a solid BMW X3 sized competitor. It also has a wide range of engine options under the hood that you don't find in this, including an over 300 horsepower engine with all-wheel drive that is a solid competitor to a BMW X3 with BMW's 3-liter turbo. Lastly, we have something like the Buick Encore. Now, I really like the Encore, but it is less expensive than this. Buick is not as premium of a brand, and of course, we don't have the same kind of luxury gadgets, options, features, etc. in the Encore that we do in the X1. It's also a decent amount slower. Let's start with the Mercedes GLA. The GLA is perhaps my least favorite of these three direct competitors. The GLA tends to be a little bit on the expensive side, even though the base price is lower than the X1. In the Mercedes, you find fewer standard features and option packages that are much more expensive than the BMW. So by the time you've comparably configured them, your BMW can be about $4,000 less expensive than the Mercedes. Although the previous X1 definitely had a handling advantage over the Mercedes GLA, that's not going on in this generation anymore. I'd actually rank the handling very, very similar. A lot of that has to do with the overall weight, the weight distribution, and the tire selection. This model has 225 with tires on it, very similar to what we see over there in the GLA. Even though you can get optional summer tires on your GLA or your X1, they're still only 225 width. Although the 8-speed automatic transmission we find in this BMW is not as exciting or as engaging as the 8-speed they use in basically every other BMW out there, it is still notably better than the dual-clutch transmission we find in the Mercedes. The dual-clutch transmission in the GLA is more refined than it is in the CLA, but it's still not as refined as a traditional automatic, and it's probably my least favorite dual-clutch on the market right now. If you're more of a fully loaded shopper, you should know that when you fully load your GLA, not only will it be more expensive than the X1, but you'll actually be missing a few features. For some reason, Mercedes has decided to limit some of the features and options in the GLA, whereas on the X1 you can basically get everything that you'd find in a luxury BMW, including a heads-up display, their finger writing recognition system on BMW's iDrive with the larger format screen. You don't get those sorts of things over there in the Mercedes, even though it will actually cost you a little bit more. Now on the flip side, Mercedes does offer a high horsepower AMG version of the GLA, making it very, very unique in this segment. You won't find one of those over here in the X1. In fact, you won't find that 3-liter turbo we found in 2015 either. Range Rover is going after a very different kind of shopper with the Evoque, and it fits with the more expensive price tag. The The Evoque is more customizable than this X1. You can also find it in a variety of different forms. It comes in 4-door, it comes in 2-door, and it also comes in convertible these days. Whatever form you want your Evoque in, you will find more customization available inside the cabin especially than we find in this X1. Of course, you're going to pay considerably more for it as well. We don't find necessarily all the features you get in the X1 over there in the Evoque, however. The advanced radar cruise control and active safety systems we find in this X1 are fairly unique in this particular segment, as is the optional heads-up display. You won't find those over there in the Evoque. When it comes to handling, the Evoque also has a slight edge over the BMW X1. However, very much like the Mercedes-Benz, the transmission is a little bit of a sore spot over there in the Range Rover. The Range Rover does use ZF's new 9-speed automatic transmission. It's the same one that we're seeing in certain Honda, Acura, and Chrysler models. Now, Chrysler especially has received an awful lot of flack for the way that 9-speed automatic transmission shifts, and it's basically the same in the Evoque. The transmission we find right here under this hood, however, feels like a very traditional automatic transmission. That transmission feel is exactly why Volvo and BMW have picked this transmission over the ZF 9-speed. Speaking of Volvo, the XC60 is one step above this in terms of overall size. Now, in the European luxury segment, its price tag does get the closest to this. That means you can see that Volvo is sort of a value upgrade a little bit more easily than something like an Audi Q5 or a Mercedes-Benz GLC, because they're going to be considerably more expensive than this. Now, the XC60 is not quite as fresh because it is due to be redesigned very soon, but it does have a new engine family under the hood and actually the same 8-speed automatic transmission that we find in the BMW X1. That transmission, coupled with their new engine family, actually gives you about the same fuel economy in the XC60 as we see in this BMW X1, but we get a little bit more room on the inside. The Lincoln MKC is a little bit confusing because it seems like it would be a BMW X1 sized vehicle. However, on the inside, it gives you more BMW X3 kind of room. That's because it sort of falls between the two in overall size, but like this, it is a front-wheel drive based or biased vehicle. That means that we get the overall packaging efficiency of a transverse engine up the front. On the flip side, the MKC and the X1 compare very well other than that. The MKC is also front-wheel drive biased, although there are two different engines to choose from, and you do need to pick the more powerful engine in order to be as fast as the BMW X1. The handling in both models is very comparable, but the suspension in the MKC is quite soft, and that is different than we see in the BMW X1. So this feels much more engaging, even though the two handle relatively similarly to one another. Overall, the styling in the MKC is a little bit less traditional than we're seeing in this luxury segment, although the overall parts quality is fairly high. Then we have the Audi Q3, which again starts at $33,700, a hair less than this. Now, Audi has a very good value proposition in this particular segment because they do equip their vehicles with very wide tires, with standard leather upholstery, and other standard features that you don't find in the base X1 or the base Mercedes GLA. However, very few people actually shop for base models, and by the time you start adding options to the X1 and options to the Q3, you end up very close to one another in terms of overall pricing, and the Q3 ends up being only about $1,000 less across the lineup. One of the big things to know about the Q3 versus the X1 is when they were released worldwide. The X1 was released worldwide and then in the United States very close to one another, so we're getting it right around the same time as everybody else in the world is. The Q3 was a little bit different. They introduced it everywhere else and then they waited a number of years before finally bringing it to the United States. That means that although the Q3 is new to this market, it's not a new vehicle overall. That difference really shows when we take a look at the X1 and we see especially some of the options that are available, like the heads-up display, the advanced radar cruise control system with all of its latest safety gadgets and features. You just don't find those over there in the Q3 at this time. It's also a little bit obvious when you take a look at the overall design of the Q3, and it doesn't quite match some of the latest Audi models. That's really why, because it's not actually a new vehicle in general. That perhaps also explains why the Q3 is considerably slower than the BMW X1. It doesn't necessarily produce that much less horsepower, but the 0 to 60 time is more than a full second behind the X1. It actually is the slowest in this particular group. On the flip side, however, Audi puts incredibly wide tires on the Q3, and that means that it handles much better than this BMW X1 out on the road. In fact, it handles incredibly well. In general, I do prefer the better handling and slightly slower vehicle to the better accelerating but slightly poorer handling vehicle. That means that overall my top pick in this particular segment is the Q3 because it is a slightly better value than the BMW X1. I also like the standard feature content we get over there in the Audi, and the handling is absolutely positively incredible. That means that the BMW comes in a very, very close second choice. And this is a very slim margin because the X1 fights back with better acceleration and better fuel economy. Before we sign off, I should tell you that my third choice in this segment is the Lincoln MKC. And if you're looking for something that's a little bit more plush, perhaps a little bit more comfortable for larger drivers or larger passengers, it's a good alternative to the X1. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes, and this has been the 2016 BMW X1. Be sure and click down there on those related videos at the bottom of your screen. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already done so, and I'll see you next week.